Well, now on BBC Radio 4, it's time for In Touch with Peter White.
Good evening. It's pretty obvious that if you want the built environment to be accessible for disabled people, by far the best way is to put the right features in from the ground up. But it's not often that you get the chance to do that. However, at the 40 plus stations which make up the Elizabeth line, which crosses London from west to east, they have had that opportunity. So how well have they grasped it? Well, I'm here on Tottenham Court Road station in the Elizabeth line part of the station to find out. Later in the programme, we're going to be visiting the art gallery just a few miles to the south of here, down in Wandsworth, where visually impaired people have been collaborating with professional artists to give people an idea of what the world looks like to them. But first, I'm joined by Clive Wood of the Guide Dogs campaign team, who's been involved in the business of trying to provide consistent features for blind and partially sighted travellers on the Elizabeth line. So, Clive, first of all, what kind of features are we talking about?
The stations are like cathedrals, actually. They're massive, they've got high ceilings, they're very open and airy, they've got good lighting in them. There's step-free access from all 41 stations, from street to platform, which is wonderful. And that's not just for people with mobility issues, that's also for other passengers, including blind and partially sighted people who prefer not to use an escalator, or who have got a guide dog who isn't trained to use an escalator. We think that's really positive.
So what is less positive, if you like? What haven't they done? Because, I mean, they've spent £19 billion on it, so you might expect that they could have done just about everything with that.
When Transport for London have taken on Elizabeth line from Crossrail, it's handed over to them as a project. There were some things such as signage. We don't think that there's enough wayfinding that's going to allow people with a sight loss to be able to navigate round the stations, because they are enormous, and we'd like to see some good tactile being used at the entrances to the train, because they have a big glass screen that blocks you off from the line. So when the train comes in, those screens doors open, but it's very difficult to know where they are unless you actually can see. So it's a bit of a guess. You have to hang around and listen to see where those entrances are. The colour contrast on the trains isn't great, so you can't see, if you've got some vision, the handrails, the grab rails, which is really important. And the one other thing that would have been really lovely and would have helped a lot of people with sight loss is knowing which side the doors are going to open when they come into a platform.
Right. Well, that could be done with announcements, couldn't it?
Absolutely.
I mean, that's just training, isn't it?
The announcements are automated, so they can be made to make that announcement. I think there was a concern from Transport for London that if they have too much information, because the stops are very close to each other, that might have caused a problem. But we think this is really important for people with sight loss, and others, I should say, because those trains aren't in the platforms for very long.
Well, I suppose the next thing we ought to do is go for a ride, isn't it? So quiet.
I know.
Next station, Farringdon. Exit for trains to Gatwick and Luton airports.
And that, presumably, is where you'd like them to have said which side you would exit the next station.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think it would make a real difference. And it's only a few words. They have a sound where so you can hear where the doors are opening. Could you determine which side it was?
It's a bit tricky if you're sitting sideways, as we are.
There we are.
Left. The trouble is that acoustically, that sort of noise is not very directional, is it?
No. Of course, we're travelling at the moment mid-afternoon,
Yeah.
so the train isn't too busy. You generally will get a seat, but the great thing that they've introduced, which we feel is really helpful, is that actually you can walk through the whole length of the train.
So that's good for blind people, but good for everybody.
Good
really.
for everybody, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And this is what we're saying about, inclusive design, Peter. It's not just for people with sight loss, it's not just for the wider disabled community, it's for everybody. Everybody is going to benefit.
Liverpool Street.
Clive Wood from Guide Dogs alighting with me on Liverpool Street. Well, listening to our journey has been Mark Evers. He's Chief Customer Officer with Transport for London, who are now responsible for the Elizabeth line. Mark, as you heard there, much to like from Clive, but still more to do. That was his verdict, I think. Can I ask you first about that absence of tactile paving on the edges of the platform as you board the trains? That seems surprising given the concern that's been expressed on this programme, amongst other places, about the slowness of putting tactile paving on mainline and other underground lines. Wouldn't this have been an ideal opportunity to do this right from the start?
A lot of work has gone into trying to ensure that the Elizabeth line is accessible. Obviously, within the central section stations on the Elizabeth line, there are platform edge doors that provide additional safety so that certainly there is no way that an individual can fall down onto the platform. But I guess we will get lots of lived experiences of people making use of the service, and then we will sort of pick up that and sort of try to make sort of improvements in the future where that's necessary.
One thing I think it would be easy for you to do something about, which really resonated with me, was that point about announcements to tell you which side you'd exit the train. I mean, when there's a lot of pushing and shoving and you're a blind person, you're a long way from the door, that would be really helpful to know which side you were going to get off. That's easy to do, isn't it?
Well, it's certainly something which, with sort of new rolling stock, so the trains that are on the system, we've got better information with both sort of audio and visual displays, because we are mindful that you do need to provide customers with that information. Like, obviously, as you sort of heard in the recording there is a noise that sort of sounds within the environment to indicate where the doors are opening and when they're opening. Certainly on some of our tube lines, we sort of provide that directional information. There's this balance that we're always trying to strike between the right amount of information that's helpful and bombarding people with too much information at key decision-making points. So, again, it's one that we can reflect upon as people start to use the Elizabeth line in greater numbers, and if there's a really good case to make those improvements, and that's something which we can certainly look to do.
Well, my personal view is that's a really helpful bit of information, and it won't do anybody else any harm. One final thing. I mean, some people will say this project began 13 years ago. It's cost £19 billion, as we've said. In spite of all the good things, couldn't we have expected the kind of features that you and I have been talking about being in from the start?
The job isn't done, and there is more work that we can do. And I think that, certainly as people use the Elizabeth line, but also start to use the Elizabeth line alongside other parts of the transport network, I'm sure that we'll learn new things as well. And certainly the job is by no means done, and it's something which we're committed to as an organisation doing more of in the future.
Mark Evers, thank you very much indeed.